Welcome to Living Legends, a podcast telling the stories and celebrating the lives of seniors, presented by GrandPad and the Leighton Media Podcast Network.
Welcome to Living Legends, the podcast where we celebrate the wisdom, experiences, and life lessons of older adults who have lived boldly and have lots of stories to tell. I'm Scott Lien, CEO and co-founder of GrandPad. And I'm thrilled to be your host as we dive into conversations with some of the most inspiring people you'll ever meet. I've always loved learning from elderly people, so I'm really excited to get to interview some of these super seniors over the age of 75. As someone who spent years developing technology that empowers older adults, I've had the privilege of hearing countless stories that are not just fascinating, but really insightful, things that will help us all learn from our elders and live our lives better. So that's what this program, Living Legends, is all about, bringing those stories to you, our listeners, so we can learn from those who went before us. One of my favorite sayings is, youth can walk faster, but the elder knows the road. So of course, we can learn from people that have been around a long time. Whether you're young or old, hopefully you'll be inspired. These will make you laugh, make you reflect, and help you live your life better. So today's episode features John Ochsner. John is not only a longtime friend that lives here in Wabasha, Minnesota, near me. But John is also one of our Grand Advisors. What's a Grand Advisor, you ask? So GrandPad is all about designing technology solutions that older adults, those over the age of 75, will love. And we quickly learn, since none of us younger folks have been 75, 80, or 90, never been that age, we don't know what, in John's case, who's 89, what an 89-year-old would want. So instead of us guessing, they just tell us. They're our designers, and we're the hands that builds the product they want. GrandPad has reached now over 1.6 million people in our 10-year history. That's the seniors like John, with the average age of the senior users is 85. Their family members, the kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, and then their doctors and caregivers. All those folks use our product to stay connected in a safe and enjoyable way. And I just emphasize safety. That's a key feature of GrandPad. We want people to have lots of conversations with family, share photos, do videos, but we keep the bad guys out. So we'll probably touch on that today as well. So John, thank you. Welcome and great to be with you.
Great to be here.
Thank you, John. So first, just tell us a little bit about yourself, just a few minutes of kind of your life history, where you were born, where you went to college, where you worked, where you've retired.
I was born right here in Wabasha, Minnesota, and led a normal active youth adventure along the Mississippi River. And then I spent years at the University of Minnesota, 11 quarters there. And to make a long story short, I ended up practicing medicine, namely urology. That's a field of medicine I was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota for 33 years, and decided to come back to Wabasha to retire.
So tell us, what year were you born? How old were you now? And tell me about, I think an interesting story about being married recently. So tell us about that.
Yes. Well, I was born in March of 1935. My wife was with me when I retired here, but she died about 8 years ago. And 4 years ago, at the start of COVID, I met a lady who came down here from northern Minnesota to join her daughter, and she had a home along the river bottoms, not more than a mile from me. But COVID kind of drove us together because I had a very active social life with my bicycle group and all that, and suddenly that went kaput. Carol had a daughter in town she could no longer really visit and spend time with. And we decided after being together for a while that we'd get married. And 3 years ago, in a few weeks, will be our third anniversary. I saw a little mark on the 25th of September on the calendar, and I thought, what are we doing there? And she said, don't you remember? And then it dawned on me, yes, I do remember.
Hey, even us younger guys have trouble remembering dates sometimes, so don't feel bad about that. There you are. You got married for the second time because you lost your first wife at age, what was it, age 86 then when you got married the second time?
Yeah, I guess so, 3 less 89. And I forgot one thing. Mm-hmm. I'm born and raised here in Wabasha, but I was the oldest of 10 kids. 8 of us were boys. So you can imagine what kind of a time we had along here over those years.
That's awesome. Isn't it great to have a big family and lots around. And Carol, who I've gotten to know as well, has a big family, and you guys are super active with all your families. Let's talk a little bit about some pivotal moments in your life. What are some things when you just look back at your life, for you personally or professionally at work or your family, over all those years, what are some big things that jump out at you that you really remember?
Well, I think the being a state resident and being able to have a educational system at the University of Minnesota that was very important and very fortuitous. And then I was in the military briefly, but during the peacetime, just before the Vietnam War, at the start of it, but I did not. I was through by the time that got very active, so that was fortuitous. A lot of my friends, they weren't wounded or killed over there, but it was not an enjoyable period of time, and not good for their practice of medicine either. They didn't get to do what they were really trained to do. So there are a lot of issues. I was very fortunate to have a wonderful wife and we raised 4 children in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and that was a booming city for those years. So I had a lot of good things going my way.
Now, one of the things, I've got this little box of cards that I like to use, life stories. I pull these out once in a while, and it's got some fun questions. And one of them is, what is something that you learned from your mom or dad?
Well, I learned that raising 10 kids was not an easy feat. I learned that, particularly from my mother, it was patience and also forgiveness. We learned you had to forgive your brothers and sisters and people throughout life because you're going to make mistakes and they're going to make mistakes. You just have to forgive and go on.
And I've seen that with you. I think you really took that to heart because I've seen, John, I think one of the things I've observed about you is you always find the good in everyone around you, and you're not critical of other people and not finding their flaws, but finding the good in them. Is that something you got from your mom?
I got it from my mom and also from our coach, Kenny Kalbrenner. He was our coach all through our high school in every sport. We only had one coach. He coached football, basketball, whatever. And later in life, I realized he knew everybody he had to coach, and he had nothing but good to say about them. And they may not have been the greatest football or basketball player, but they had something good going for them, and he recognized that.
Kind of reminds me, there's been a series really popular on Apple TV about Ted Lasso. Have you heard about Ted Lasso? Yes. And he's a coach of the soccer team. Yeah. And not only did he always find the good in everyone and lift them up, but he figured out how to make them play together and become a great team. But for him, it wasn't about winning. It was about being a really good team. Have you heard about Ted Lasso?
Yes, I saw that series. I don't know if I've seen all of them, but I've seen a good deal of it, and I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Maybe Kenny Kalbrenner here in Wabasha was the original inspiration for Ted Lasso, and I got to know Kenny as well, who lived to just be close to 100, and he was a character and a fun guy and an interesting guy his whole life, wasn't he?
Yes. Yeah, he had no children of his own. I think he adopted every kid he coached, and I remember we celebrated his 25th year of coaching, and he coached for a number of years after that. So he was there for a long time.
And he's a great example of someone that Kenny grew up, so Kenny was significantly older than you, and he grew up in a time when polio was ravaging the U.S. and there was no vaccine. And Kenny was afflicted by polio, and he had a lifelong where he had a serious limp, but he never let that be a disability. It was just part of his abilities, right?
Yes, and I don't want to leave my father out, and I'll never forget, he knew I was kind of interested in medicine, so he took me along to the hospital. He was a surgeon here in Wabasha, and he did a rather delicate, it wasn't so-called delicate, it was a bowel surgery, but he finished up and he was not satisfied, and he took part of it down and redid it. So I learned that perfection was very important, in particularly in surgery and medicine.
Now, one of the things I wanted to cover is I understand that you had a job as you were growing up delivering newspapers. Is that right? Can you tell us a little bit about how, not just that job you had, but kind of what it was like back then? So this is in the 30s, 40s?
40s,
right?
Probably late 40s. Yes, it was the Winona Republican Herald that I peddled, and it was 6 days a week. There was no Sunday paper. And boy, I walked a long way for 25 papers in a small town. I went out to farms right on the edge of town. Oh, gosh. That was
How old
something.
were you?
Oh, I suppose I did that when I was 12 to 15, something in that area.
And so what's interesting, my wife did this as well. Yeah. My wife, Sally, is just a year younger than me. I'm 59. She did papers, her whole family, when she was that age. So I think it was pretty common for kids, elementary age kids, 5, 10, 12 years old. They would all deliver papers, right?
Right. Yeah, they're very common.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about how did people get information back then? So you had the newspaper, you had radios. This is way before TVs. How did people get information?
Radio, and I'll get into that later. Radio was it. The newspaper was very important to kind of devour the news a little bit, but for action and for the staying attuned to the present of the minute to minute. You would listen for any alerts on the radio or weather or whatever it was, and the radio was it.
Radio was real time. Everybody listened to the radio. People got a daily newspaper 6 days a week, and it was printed that day and delivered in the evening. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep. I remember as a kid in the summertime, all summer long, listening to the Chicago Cubs games. It was before the Twins and whatever, and the Cubs were it.
Just talking about a little bit more about radio and the way you got information. So radio was real time. You had newspapers that came every day. Of course, in the small town, there was the grapevine, right? Of word got around. So if something happened in town, it would quickly go just word of mouth throughout town. Of course, you had telephones then, so people would ring up and talk on the phone.
Telephone was a no-no because my father was a physician here in town. We had one line. Most people had party lines. We had one line that came in. He had 10 kids, and they were not allowed to be on the telephone. He had many emergencies, and he was a surgeon. That was a no-no for us. Telephone, to talk to a kid on the phone didn't happen.
So if you wanted to get a hold of one of your friends
to play
ball,
you got on your bike and you rode to them and talked to them.
Right.
Or
good old-fashioned face-to-face was the way that you did it back then. Yeah, that was the way you communicated. With radio, though, it was also a form of entertainment, right? So there was some reoccurring radio shows. Tell us about those.
Well, I've got to think a minute, but in the afternoon after school, often Terry and Pirates was the popular one. Dick Tracy may not only have been a comic strip, and comic strips in the newspaper were very important. Inner Sanctum, the initial introduction to it was so scary that we seldom listened to it. There were any number of Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy. So there were a series of things, and the problem with and we got Life magazine and the comic strips, the papers, that there was a constant pecking order and who gets it first. And, with 10 kids, you couldn't all read and devour it at the same time. So it was always a little contentious.
When you think back about big news that happened, especially in your younger life, of something like a news flash would come over the radio. Do you remember some big things that came across the radio back in the day?
Well, the story that I was going to get at is in 1948. On this coming Thursday, it'll be 76 years. I remember very well riding in the car, I think down 60, down into Wabasha. I don't know what we were doing, but hearing the news flash that there was a plane crash near Fountain City across from Winona, Minnesota. In 1948, it was at that time, it was the worst loss of life, the worst crash that Northwest Airlines had ever had. And I remember that so well, and it was very impressive. And it came back to me later, 50 years later, in 1998, Winona State was playing Ferris State in football in Winona, and the coach of Ferris State was the son of a friend of ours in Sioux Falls, so we had decided to meet in Winona on that Saturday, the next day, and watch the game. And so I went down to at that time, I think it was 7-Eleven, it's now a Quick Trip, and got a Winona paper to get the time and place, etc., for the game. And the whole paper was dedicated to the 50th anniversary of this plane crash. And it had 2 or 3 pages of not only the story, but pictures of the items found. And I remember a rosary. One of the passengers was a priest. It may not have been his rosary, but there were also very nice utensils and some eating material. And my neighbor here in Wabasha, when I retired, was a Boy Scout at the time, and they scoured the area for items. And another friend of mine that age remembers that his uncle had a farm across the river in that area, and they found some plane parts in his farm. So anyway, that brought that all back to me. But the real interesting thing was a week or 2 later, I'm back in Sioux Falls seeing my patients, and one of them, an 81-year-old from Alcester, just south of Sioux Falls, a rural area, asked me where I was retiring to. And I said, well, I'm retiring to a little town called Wabasha between Winona and Red Wing. Oh, he looked at me and he said, Winona, my cousin was killed in a plane crash there. He didn't say when, it was a long time ago. And the cousin was very close to him. They were the same age. He was a neighbor on the farm, and it was like losing his twin brother. And he was very sad. They had to go over, the family had to go over and identify the items that might be his. He was the pilot, and his name was Johnson. I can't think of his first name, but he said he flew to Chicago that morning and was flying back. It was a Martin 202, and he said the only thing he added to it was that they thought there were problems with the rudder. But even though it was kind of stormy weather, that it was more than that. It gave me those details, which were very interesting. And I then went down to Winona and sent him some copies of the papers. So anyway, that was a very memorable situation.
Well, John, it's incredible that your recollection of that story that happened in 1948 when you were just a young man. I've just, with the benefit of Wikipedia, looked this up, and everything is right on. The captain, you're absolutely right. His last name was Johnson. Robert Leslie Johnson. And it was a Martin 202 flight. It was flight 421 that was flying from Chicago, Illinois to Minneapolis, August 29th, 1948. And it crashed just between Winona and Fountain City, and the wreckage was spread around. 33 passengers and 4 crewmen all perished. But what's incredible, because that was kind of in the infancy of traveling, right, and air travel, but it said that it was the deadliest accident on a Martin 202 flight, but it was Northwest Airlines' worst air disaster at the time, and the first accident that had happened in over 1 billion miles of flight at that time, which is pretty incredible. And it was a structural issue, a failure, airframe structural issue. So very, very interesting to recall that, John, and how a word traveled fast. And you said that was the radio that you heard that, right? And then everybody, I'm sure, in the whole town was talking about it, right?
Yeah. And I'm sure it was Winona Radio, because they were, it would have been a staticky day. It wasn't FM in those days. And we depended on our close neighbor, Winona, for a lot of things.
John, as we kind of wrap up here, I'd love to get your words of wisdom for our listeners as you just think, as a 89-year-old man who's had a wonderful life. You truly are a wonderful person who I respect and admire. You've had a successful career, a wonderful family. Now starting a new life with Carol, but the 20-year-old kids that are just in college and kind of starting out in life, what's your advice you'd give them for their life?
Boy, that's a tough one. And I think you just have to go along with the age, and you've got to be attuned to what's in life, and you've got to work hard. You've got to get a goal and a purpose and work hard for it. Make up your mind that you want to do something, but be able to adjust. I think my goal, was a physician. I thought, well, if I don't make that, maybe I'll be a veterinarian. I had a few options, but that I might. But I think you have to be ready to move into different avenues of what you think you might want to do, and don't try to start on the top of the ladder. Be willing to work down below and learn the fundamentals, and you'll get to where you need to be ultimately.
Excellent. And I just emphasize what you said earlier, too, that you've modeled your life of always just finding the best in people, not finding their flaws, finding the good, right?
That's right. That's true.
Good. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there, and I really thank everyone for listening today. I invite you to reflect on some of the lessons you heard from John today in his life. As, again, I'm so fortunate to have met John and so many other people like him through my role here as CEO at GrandPad and getting to know this fantastic group of people I call super seniors. Make sure you subscribe to Living Legends and share the podcast. You can learn more about what we do at GrandPad at grandpad.net. Of course, we're on all the normal social media sites as well. Thank you, everybody.
You've been listening to Living Legends, a podcast celebrating the lives and stories of seniors, presented by GrandPad and the Lien Media Podcast Network. You'll find Living Legends at WinonaRadio.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to like and subscribe.